If you're watching this video, then you're probably in a perfectionism rut. Nothing you draw looks right to you, and no matter how much you draw it over and over again, it doesn't seem to get better. So I've put together some advice that I think can help with this, and I think my last tip will be surprisingly useful. I think the most common advice is to draw with a timer, which I agree can be very useful. Of course, this forces you to finish the drawing in a certain time limit. I personally have done this with some studies lately. I'm doing the sketchbook slam challenge, and with the 600 pages to fill, it really forces you to not be a perfectionist, otherwise you'll literally never finish it. In fact, if you have problems with perfectionism, I recommend trying this challenge. But also not to mention that this is even worse since it's literal studies, like they're most likely not going to turn out great the first time. So I found that limiting myself to around 5 minutes a page has helped a lot in making sure I don't get obsessed with details. It makes me really just focus on the most important parts. But I think people often only use this method for sketches, but you can use this method for finished illustrations as well. For instance, if it takes you 5 hours to do a full illustration, but you want to be able to do it in like 4 or 3 hours, you can start setting a timer for that time. And no matter what state that drawing is, just mark it as finished. If you want to come back to it later, that's fine, but just consider it done and maybe give yourself a week or two before allowing yourself to come back to it and decide if you'd really like to keep going or not. I think this will force you to get used to working faster and learn to accept small mistakes that in reality the vast majority of people will never notice. Not to mention all those tiny details that are lost once you zoom out. Which, speaking of zooming in too much, don't. A lot of artists run into this issue of allowing themselves to zoom in so much that it becomes very easy to lose track of the piece as a whole. Not to mention, you could be working on a detail for ages only to zoom out and realize it doesn't even look right with the rest of the piece, as well as it being very easy to fall into the trap of focusing too much on the tiny details that in reality, again, aren't even visible the moment you zoom out of the piece. I've been studying Kuroshiro's art style recently for my next art style study video, which will be at Friday, by the way. And I noticed that he doesn't seem to really let himself zoom in almost at all. He stays very zoomed out for the vast majority of the drawing. So I imagine this has helped him not get obsessed with details or lost in the piece, and is a great example that you can make a beautiful artwork without having to zoom into every single small tiny detail. Not to mention the countless artists that don't even really do small details and yet have really pretty art. Another tip I have that I feel like a lot of people, including myself, don't necessarily do is thumbnails. I cannot tell you how many times I wasn't super happy with the drawing or was lost with where to take it when this could easily be fixed with thumbnails. Thumbnails are something that almost every successful artist seems to do to some degree, at least from what I can tell. And some like to get really detailed with them, others keep them pretty loose. Personally, I just try to get the overall vibe and composition down, but others will do more detailed sketches with multiple color passes to figure out colors, among other things. The point is that a thumbnail can really just help you in making sure that the piece you have in mind will look the way you think it'll look. So sometimes I might have an idea, draw a rough sketch of that pose and composition, only to realize that it actually doesn't look as good as I thought it would. And since it's just a thumbnail, I didn't lose a lot of time to figure that out. Oftentimes, I spend less than 5 minutes on a thumbnail. Another useful experience has been doing color tests. You can actually wait to do these until after you finish the line art or sketch of the piece, but they're really useful if you're like me and still struggle with color and still struggle with color theory. So instead, just use a brush and do some large strokes with paint to get a rough color scheme. Again, you're not focusing on trying to stay inside the lines or anything like that. You're just placing blobs of color to make sure that the overall color scheme of the entire piece makes sense and looks good. So instead of trying to figure out the colors on top of figuring out the rendering, this allows you to really just be able to focus primarily just on the rendering and make sure it all looks good and not trying to figure out a good color scheme at the same exact time. Kind of following off thumbnails, another tip I have is to break down your process. I think sometimes it's very easy for us to jump ahead and try to work on the details without making sure we have a strong foundation to build off of. So for instance, when I make a drawing, I try to first focus on the overall shapes and make sure they make sense before doing a rough oversketch for things like clothes, hair, facial feature placement, before finally drawing in the actual details of everything. And I just want to clarify that when I say an oversketch of things like clothes and hair, I'm not getting in the details of the clothes or even the details of the hair. Like, it very much is really just the shape of the overall clothes and like the rough shape of the hair. And then even after all of that, I still focus primarily on the bigger details first, and then I prefer to go in a little bit later and work out the smaller details if they're even needed. Another good example of this is, again, Kuroshiro, where he draws the actual body no matter if it's covered by clothes or not. And I think this allows him to make sure the way the clothes fall on the character looks very accurate. So even though it might take him a little bit more time, it does result in a better final piece, so you're not doing a bunch of small tweaks trying to fix it at the very end. On top of everything else, I think it's important to remember what our expectations are as well. Oftentimes we come up with this amazing piece in our heads, but oftentimes either lack the skill needed to recreate said image or fail to realize that while it may look good in our head, it doesn't actually look as good in real life. Some of this I think can be mitigated by doing proper preparation with things like thumbnails, but the other part is also just based on mindset. If you catch yourself trying to imagine a piece that you know is well above your skill level, it can be useful to take a moment and try to rethink the image in your mind to something more realistic. This isn't to say that you shouldn't try hard pieces or to push yourself out of your comfort zone, but to just mentally prepare yourself by reminding yourself that this is something that you're not super confident you can make in the way that you want to, that you will give it your all, but that if it doesn't turn out the way you wanted it to, that's fine. Since it wasn't a total waste of time, you really tried to push yourself out of your comfort zone, learn something new, and at the end of the day, even if it didn't work out, you still learned something from the piece. Which, by the way, is another good thing to do, even if you liked the piece, to give yourself a break from the piece and come back to it and reassess it and see what you did well and what you didn't do so well. If the piece is crazy hard that you don't even want to try, then I recommend just writing it down in details on a notes app or something similar, like a piece of paper or whatever, and periodically come back to that list and see if you feel ready to tackle any of these pieces. Maybe even include a very rough sketch to the best of your ability for you to use for future reference. If you're still having a problem of just not liking anything you make, it could also be a sign that it's time to do some art studies. I know that most of us don't really like doing them, but if you're seriously not happy with anything you're making, you may just be ready to level up. Or at least that's how I like to think about it. Basically, your brain has improved in its ability to break down art visually, but if you haven't been doing studies, then you may be getting frustrated because while you've visually gotten better at noticing these mistakes, you haven't let yourself do the studies necessary to know how to fix them. Just hoping it goes away on its own, trust me, sadly does not work that way, at least not usually. Even just doing a study for a day can help a lot. So I recommend, let's say you hate your hands. Try doing some hand studies for a week, like proper dedicated hand studies, and see how you feel, since I have a feeling you'll feel a lot better about your drawings again afterwards, at least when it comes to the hands. I've personally been doing this to improve my anatomy as a whole, with my next focus being hands and then arms, plus some head studies in between so I don't get bored of just hands. But even though I really only just started on this anatomy focus again, I've already seen so much improvement in my art. Okay, and now it's time for what I think is a rather unique tip, and that's to look for artists with a messy art style. Years ago, when I was really getting into drawing again, a lot of the artists I was used to had very clean line art, and the videos I watched emphasized using clean line art. So I tried my best to follow these tips while completely ignoring the fact that I clearly didn't enjoy it. I always loved the sketching process, but found the line art process very tedious and boring, and didn't like how the life of the piece seemed to leave whenever I did clean line art. I thought I had to just keep getting better until one day I just stopped and asked myself, hold on, do you still feel this way about professional art pieces too? And the answer to that was yes. When I looked at sketches of artists with a clean art style, I still thought that they looked much more lively than the final piece. Now, I'm not saying that their art is bad, it's pretty. I just realized that I really like the messy look that a sketch gives, the life that it brings, that I feel like even in professionals' work, I still feel like the clean line art, you just lose some of that liveliness. So not too long ago after that, I decided to do some research on artists and found a whole field of artists that have very messy styles, and I absolutely loved the look. Some artists are artists like Blue Biscuits, who's also on YouTube, or Hyde, who isn't available on YouTube, but they do stream on Twitch, and I find that the streams are very useful, but their art, both of their arts, are overall a very messy style. Their art, while messy, is still pretty clear about what's happening. Even though their art has an overall very messy style, it's not messy to the point that you can't really tell what's happening. It's messy while still being very clear about what's going on in the piece. With these new inspirations in mind, I started to let myself be looser in my pieces, and now I think I'm slowly finding a much looser and messier style that not only do I like visually more, but I also just enjoy drawing more. Sketching has always been my favorite part of art, and now I just treat my sketch as basically my line art after a bit of cleanup occasionally. So, maybe exploring artists with the style can help you loosen up your own art style too, and maybe help you realize that maybe you don't want that clean art style that everyone else is telling you that you have to have. Maybe you just enjoy the messy art style like me, in which case, that's fine. I will say that at the current moment, I still don't think my art style is messy enough. Like, I want it to be like even messier, but I am working towards breaking that habit of having all my lanes be super clean. But okay, that was all my advice for overcoming perfectionism in art. I feel like while I still struggle with it, sometimes I wouldn't say it's really a major hindrance to me anymore at this point because of all the tips I've laid out in this video, especially the last one. For the artwork in this video, I was working out some thumbnails for what I plan on drawing in Inktober, which I have a whole video about as well if that's interesting. I normally post about character design and sketchbook sessions on Monday and Wednesday, and then every Friday I post an art style study video. This week's art style study is going to be of Kuroshiro, so if any of that sounds interesting, feel free to subscribe, leave a like if this was helpful, and leave a comment if you have any more questions. Okay, bye-bye!